Hi, everyone, and welcome to Diplomats at Work. I think a few of you are still trickling in, but why don't we go ahead and get started? The series is a partnership between AFSA and the Una Chapman Cox Foundation, and it is designed to introduce audiences to the interesting and, of course, important work of the U.S. Foreign Service. By hearing stories told by the diplomats themselves about their life and work in the Foreign Service. A few words about our organization, AFSA. The American Foreign Service Association is the professional association and the labor union for the U.S. Foreign Service. Our members, about 16,000 members, are active duty and retired members of the Foreign Service from across 6 foreign affairs agencies. I think you are all familiar with, of course, the State Department, but our members also come from the U.S. Agency for International Development, from the Foreign Commercial Service, Foreign Agricultural Service, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, and the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Today's guest is from the State Department, from the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service. And we will be talking to Nico Figueroa about his life and work as a special agent with the Diplomatic Security Service. We'll talk to him about his role at DSS, but also about the role he played in last year's Operation Allies Refuge, which was the evacuation of at-risk citizens from Kabul, Afghanistan, one of the largest, I think the largest air evacuation in history. As many of you know, August 16th marked the 1-year anniversary of the Kabul airlift. And in many ways, it's a very difficult anniversary to mark. But we also thought it was maybe an opportunity to highlight the work of the members of the Foreign Service who answered the call to action and helped to evacuate more than 120,000 at-risk civilians from Afghanistan, at times, by putting themselves at great risk. So I can't wait to get to this promising and very interesting conversation. That said, as usual, I always have a few housekeeping items that I like to highlight for everybody. For those of you who are familiar with Diplomats at Work, welcome back. We have a pretty set format, which is we talk to our guests for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we open the floor to Q&A from our audience. So I know a few of you have already submitted some questions during your registration, but I encourage everyone, even those of you who have submitted already, to continue putting in questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then when the time comes to it, I will read those questions out loud to Nico. Secondly, this event is being recorded, and as always, we will upload the recording to our YouTube channel, AFSATube, and there you can also find recordings of our previous programs as well. And then finally, we love to hear from you, so please take a few minutes to answer the survey. We'll drop the link in the chat box as well. The survey really helps us understand how you're liking these programs and what we can do to make them even more relevant and more interesting for you. So it really is a couple of minutes to take the survey and let us know your thoughts. I will remind you again before we finish this program. So with all that said, I would like to welcome Nico to this program. Welcome, Nico. Thank you so much for joining us today, all the way from Abuja, Nigeria.
Hey, thank you for having me, Anja. Appreciate your time and effort putting this together.
Well, great. I see you've brought a friend with you today. Who is this?
This is my deputy, Ted. He's joined me on a couple other presentations that I've done in the past and joining me today. So courtesy of my daughter, Maya, to approve his calendar to appear.
Well, welcome, Ted. We love having you. So, Nico, you are not, in fact, our first DSS special agent on the series, I should say. However, that program was a long time ago, and so for those who either didn't get to see it or don't really know much about the Diplomatic Security Service, I do want to get us started today by talking about what is DSS, what is DSS's role in our government, and just help us understand more about your organization.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, we are federal law enforcement. We're the federal law enforcement arm of the State Department, and we're a bureau underneath the umbrella of the State Department. We report to the management office in headquarters, and then the management office then reports to the Secretary of State. So for us, we're basically tasked with securing diplomacy, protecting travel documents, passport, visa fraud are the main criminal investigations that we do. And then because of our connection with obviously the embassies and the consulates around the world, where guys like me are assigned to do to run program management for security at the embassies and the consulates. We have presence at more than 270 locations around the world. We are the furthest reaching law enforcement entity for the US government. And so, but we're also comprised not just of agents, we have diplomatic couriers, security engineering officers, security technical specialists, and then we also have a uniform division that functions at our facilities stateside. So it's a pretty robust team to really kind of bring forth basically the vast mission that is doing diplomacy around the world.
Thank you. So you're currently an assistant regional security officer in Abuja, an ARSO. What does this mean? What does your title mean? And what does this job entail? And also I wanted to ask if you could give us, you already gave us a flavor of some of the other types of jobs, but what is kind of a typical DSS job?
So we essentially have what I like to refer to as three pillars. So I mentioned already our criminal investigations, where we focus on primarily passport and visa fraud, but overseas here in the embassy, I kind of like to think of us as the sheriffs of this little town that is the embassy community. So any criminal investigations that occur within the jurisdiction of our embassy facility here, we also handle that. And if anything goes beyond the scope of kind of what we would regard as a traditional State Department investigation, we can involve other law enforcement partners. But the second pillar beyond criminal investigations is our protection. So we do protection for Secretary of State, other obviously diplomats within the State Department, but also visiting dignitaries at the cabinet level. So think of us like most people are quite familiar with Secret Service. They're a much larger agency. Obviously, they're affiliated with protecting the president, vice president, and POTUS, or the FLOTUS, if you will. So basically, we do the same kind of thing when it comes to protection, but we're one level below, presidents or prime ministers and things like that. So any visiting Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Dalai Lama, a host of other visiting foreign diplomats, that's protection that we take primacy on. And then also as regional security officers, which is what I'm doing now here in Abuja, again, we basically manage all the portfolio of security programs that facilitate the protection of our personnel and our facilities. And first and foremost, we're all diplomats to begin with, but we are tasked with managing those security programs at the embassies and the consulates and our missions worldwide. And so for here, I'm one of three ARSOs at our post. I have a deputy and a senior ARSO. There's 5 of us total. And then I have a team of an American travel coordinator who helps me manage the travel program throughout Nigeria. We have the upper 2/3 of Nigeria, and Consulate Lagos has the lower third of Nigeria when it comes to travel and RSO policy. But I also have 5 Foreign Service national investigators, very experienced former host nation security officers of their own right, who have been with us for many years and bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to to our team. I also have 7 currently. We're hopefully hiring one soon, locally employed bodyguards. And then I have 28 currently host nation Nigerian police officers assigned to us as bodyguards for the ambassador, our deputy chief of mission, and our USAID country team director. And then I have 4 open source analysts who help me and our mission here evaluate all manner of social media news, any type of open source information that we need to evaluate for security purposes. And then I also have a soon to be, hopefully we fill another spot for a locally employed admin assistant in our RSO office. And that pretty much rounds out the team that I have here.
That sounds like a very robust team. So as you mentioned, one of the key roles, as you mentioned, one of the key roles of DSS is to protect diplomacy and our diplomats. And that sometimes includes evacuating or closing embassies in times of emergencies. And in fact, when you were posted to Kabul last summer, this is exactly what you ended up doing, even though I don't think this was something that you expected to be doing when you got posted there in the first place. So can you tell us kind of how it all played out, what you arrived in Kabul to do, and then how you came to be part of this team, part of this evacuation team, and on the airplane heading to Doha on that fateful Monday, August 16th?
Yeah, so things probably would have went a lot better if I had Ted there to help us out, but unfortunately, he couldn't make the trip. I arrived end of July last summer, 2021. My job going there was to take on the RSO logistics and budget portfolio, which basically was comprised of oversight for over 400 armored vehicles, a myriad of RSO, regional security officer equipment, anything from firearms to ammunition to, body armor, you name it. And then, of course, our budget portfolio, which admittedly, I'm not a numbers guy, liberal arts graduate, so I had help of a great assistant, very specialized in her adept, knowledge about budget, who basically ran that for me. But the ultimate responsibility lied with me, and that was roughly about a $30 million budget from my own estimate. And so again, end of July. At that time when I arrived, I was already planning my holiday leave. Of course, we knew the military had a very definitive date that they were departing at the end of August. But at that point in time, we weren't really sure exactly how long the diplomatic footprint would remain. But there were estimates anywhere from 6 months to a year at that point. And that was with essentially 2.5 weeks remaining before we actually ended up evacuating. So just to give you an idea of the sheer timeline and how quickly compressed it came. So that's kind of why I give you that. But less than a month later, as I mentioned, we had about 34 of us agents, a host of contract personnel and other RSO support staff. We were given 4 days. We got the call on a Thursday, and we were told, as time went on from that initial call, that we had to have everybody out by Sunday. And so what was at the time the largest embassy in the world quickly became the smallest embassy in the world, because everybody was gone by Monday, just after midnight on Sunday. And they had all either been completely evacuated from the country or were relocated to the Kabul airport, which is about 3 kilometers, less than 5 kilometers away from the embassy itself. And so myself and two other agents were tasked with going ahead of the main body because I had the logistics portfolio and the understanding and the knowledge of kind of what that entailed. And my two other colleagues, Bill Womack and Tony Ramirez, we joined each other. We eventually got on an aircraft out of Kabul and to Doha. We landed in Doha early hours of Monday morning. And we were anticipating basically the rest of our embassy staff, including the ambassador, to follow shortly behind us. And as we now know, obviously they remained for basically 2 more weeks until they finally flew out with the rest of the military on that last aircraft. And so all told, we left behind about a little over 100 State Department personnel. About better than half of that was RSO personnel between our contractors and agents. And yeah, so when I got to Doha, when myself, Tony, and Bill got to Doha, we weren't really sure what we were expecting. We didn't even know we were going to Doha until basically the day of, because there was some discussion of going to other locations. And so everything was just kind of going, ad hoc, if you will. And so there were only 6 Afghans on the flight that I went out on, 3 adults, 3 children. The children, had the clothes on their back and no shoes. And that kind of set off alarms in Doha that there were these undocumented Afghans on our flight because nobody knew they were coming. And shortly thereafter was that famed flight that many folks saw, about 600-700 Afghans on a C-17 that were coming after us. And once we identified ourselves as diplomatic security to the folks that were there, it was primarily at that time, it was just Embassy Doha volunteer staff. And I met up with another agent from Embassy Doha, and he just basically gave me a hug and he was like, "I'm glad you're here because we got a plane with 600 Afghans and we don't know, we've heard everything that has been hijacked, they're armed, like all kinds of things, and we just need your help." And so, I mean, that was the kind of the craziness that was going on. And it was just, it was complete and utter chaos, and it only got worse as time went on. I ended up staying there for about 3 months total, and I worked a myriad of jobs between what came to be a humanitarian crisis at the base in Doha, to standing up the new, assisting and standing up the new Afghan Affairs unit that is still active in Doha. That's essentially mission Afghanistan forward, supporting diplomacy to the Afghanistan mission.
So that sounds, I think in the span of 2 weeks, it sounds like many different things happened at lightning speed. And I can't imagine if there's any way to prepare for that while you're going through it. So when you got to Doha, and I don't know if people know, or maybe by now they know, that Doha ended up being, I guess, unexpectedly, maybe the hub, or the biggest hub, or one of the biggest hubs for the outflow of evacuees from Afghanistan. So I don't know if you probably didn't know that when you were landing in Doha, right? You thought you were just getting there to get things ready for the diplomats coming out of Kabul. So how did that look, landing in Doha, and then how did that look? And then the next few days, how it played out when all of you realized that it was not as you expected, and there were all of these people coming in, and they all needed to be placed somewhere, and they all needed to be supported.
Yeah. So, like I said, there was no planning of anything, because everything was unexpected. As you mentioned, how it played out. The sheer number of folks that were coming into Doha, and really the impetus for folks going to Doha just came down to a logistics thing. It was the closest. I mean, the base there, it's a Qatari base, but it's jointly operated with American Air Force primarily. And so it's actually the largest American presence, military presence in the region. So they have the largest airfield, the biggest footprint. And so just for about a 3-hour flight from Kabul to Doha on a C-17 jet, whereas like, for example, Kuwait, which was another potential option, was about a 5-hour transit. And so aircraft was leaving Kabul, going to Doha, dropping people, and then it would just turn and burn basically. And so what we didn't know at the time was, so originally Doha was set up to only receive about, I think, 8,000 folks. And so the original plan was all of our staff at the embassy, the special interest visa eligible folks that were vetted by the U.S. government, they had worked for U.S. government, for the military, for State Department, what have you. Those folks were supposed to get authorization to leave Afghanistan and come to the U.S. via Doha. There was an old army camp that was set up to house folks and feed and all that stuff. That was only set up for about 8,000 people. And as you and folks are aware now, we ended up in Doha specifically, we had over 60, 70,000 people ended up coming through there. 120,000 estimated total, which that number continues to rise because people continue to be evacuated. And so those numbers is really what overcame our ability to maintain order, to maintain a humanitarian effort just became out of control. The worst had yet to come, basically, because these evacuees that were coming, many of them undocumented, folks literally, you've seen the photos, they overcame the airport and just climbed on the aircraft. And at some point, the Air Force, staff on the aircraft just decided to close their doors and take off. Some of them with people still riding on the outside of the aircraft, which my team there had to watch, that happen. And so they turned hangars into holding areas. These hangars were only meant to hold aircraft and maybe a small contingent of maintenance folks. And, we were throwing thousands of people just to get them out of the heat. This time of year in Doha, it's over 115 degrees every day with, 80 to 90, if not 100% humidity sometimes. And so it was just a chaos. Limited bathrooms, no AC, at least it wasn't able to keep up with the amount of people in the hangars. No cold water, not enough food. We had 2 medical staff to start with for thousands of people. We were discovering folks with a myriad of infectious diseases, and it was utterly heartbreaking to see children, elderly walking on pavement and on asphalt in this heat and not, as a diplomat, you want to present the best of what the U.S. is. We couldn't do that because we were just overwhelmed. And, these folks are coming off aircraft, probably thinking they're in the U.S. already, praising Allah because they're free. And then they're subjected to this, probably thinking, I thought the U.S. was here to take care of us. Why are we being subjected to this? At one point, the ambassador who was in charge of the OAR mission, Ambassador Greta Holtz, she wanted to go see one of the hangars because she had gotten word that a mutual acquaintance was part of the melee, if you will. And when we went into the hangar, I went with her just to give her some, because here's this, woman who's, obviously somebody, they don't know who she is, half of them, but she enters into this space and they're like, who's this woman coming to see us? So I just wanted to make sure nothing went crazy. And it wasn't, what you might expect people coming up, hey, I need help with a visa, or I need, this, that, and the other. It was folks pointing at their children who were flush red because they were burning up in the heat of this environment. They had no cold. They're literally just like, can you help us get fans? Can we get some cold water? Like, that's the kind of thing that they were asking for. And to her credit, I mean, loved working with her because she was just somebody who was like, this needs to be done, you go do it, and like make things happen. And that's basically what it became, was people from all walks of life, State Department, military, hosts of other government agencies participating, just coming forward and just helping in any way they can. I didn't sleep literally the first 3 days that I was on the ground. We had a hotel. It was a 5-star hotel in downtown Doha at the Ritz-Carlton. I went into the room on the 3rd day I was there, dropped my bags, looked at the bed, and I was like, there's no way I can sleep in this room knowing the conditions people are in. And so we went back to work. And so that's basically what happened. And I mean, that's a wave tops description of what happened and what I saw, and some of the chaos that we dealt with.
So as you mentioned, initially it was a relatively small team that arrived to Doha, and the local, the U.S. Embassy in Doha, the team there that was helping to set up everything and to receive these people. But pretty soon you were joined, as you said, by others, by colleagues from the State Department, by others from other USG agencies, and even others from around the world. And so what did that cooperation look like? How did you work together, and how did that look like?
So everyone, because everything happened so quickly, all the powers that be, if you will, were hearing what we were telling them. We don't have bathrooms, we don't have food, we don't have water, we don't have air conditioning. We need to process these people. We need to, get them moved on to, because other countries, other bases were coming on and saying, hey, we'll take people, let us help alleviate some of the stress of the numbers. But we just didn't want to, have our problem become somebody else's problem. So we were trying to get folks processed, get them biometrically enrolled, all those types of things. So we had TDY personnel from, obviously, Department of State, from DHS, from TSA, all the 3 letters, right? CBP, FBI, CDC, US.
For those of us not in the know, can you spell out some of those?
Yeah.
Some of the 3 letters?
I know.
TDY means.
Yeah. So Department of Homeland Security, TSA, the same folks that you guys run into at the airports, and you got to, open your bag and all that. Those folks came to help us. Customs and Border Patrol about immigration, FBI, Bureau of Investigation, CDC, Centers for Disease Control, because, like I said, a crap load of infectious diseases were found, obviously, in the population. US Aid, you mentioned them earlier, obviously our military counterparts, the Qataris, we couldn't, I'll give you a story. So when we were basically at our bursting point, the CEO of Qatari Airways came, I believe, to Ambassador Holtz and the team, and maybe even, obviously, Embassy Doha, and essentially was like, look, I'll give you aircraft. Where do you need them to go? Just basically, here you go. Let's move people, because we were literally running out of aircraft, military aircraft to transport folks. And we couldn't get charter aircraft there fast enough. So some may remember that the president enacted the, I forget what it's called now, but basically imploring private companies to send aircraft to support, moving and stuff like that. So that happened. So folks were going to Spain, Germany, UAE, UK, obviously to the US. And so, yeah, I mean, it was just a complete partnership across the board, and nobody, I never had to say, hey, I'm diplomatic security, or I didn't have to wear my badge around my neck. It just didn't matter. If you were there to help, you could assist. I mean, The other piece of it was we had Afghans stay
Mhm.
behind who let they let their family go ahead of them, but they insisted on staying behind to assist because they wanted to do translation services. They wanted to just help in any way that they could because they were seeing their fellow Afghans in dire need, and so that's what they did.
Thank you for that. So as we know, obviously photos or pictures tell 1,000 words or whatever the expression is. And you were very generous in sharing photos from this period, your personal photos from this period with us. And so we wanted to share these photos and maybe have you talk through them, some of these things that you mentioned, sort of that departing flight from Kabul and then being in Doha. And anyway, just putting photos or putting pictures to these stories that actually happened. So why don't we put that slide deck up and have you walk us through it? So let's see, starting
All right, so
here. Here's Nico.
yeah, there's me, a little less hair. But on the right there to your screen, I was taking that picture from my room. It was kind of the initial collection of staff that were told to put on body armor. You could carry a backpack and maybe one, drag bag or a piece of luggage. And they were on standby to start making. This was the first day on Thursday to start making their way to the helicopter landing zone to get transported to the airport, and ultimately out of the country. On the left there, that's myself, Bill Guthridge, Bill Womack, a couple of my colleagues. That was our ride on a helicopter from the embassy to the airport. And so on cue, there's the helicopter landing zone. I took this photo, obviously. This was during the next day. So folks would walk with their luggage. There was 4 separate landing zones for the helicopters, and folks would just walk out to the helicopter, walk up the ramp, and be transported over to the airport to get on a C-17. So this was actually at the embassy compound. This was our soccer field. Years ago, my first time in Afghanistan was in 2009. This used to be the area where they had like a bazaar. And so, turned into our evacuation landing zone. The document on the right was one of the initial attempts at providing our staff and vetted special interest visa holders with some official-esque documentation that they could, either present on a phone or print off and go to the airport and say, hey, look at me, I'm approved to enter the airport and be transported out because I work for the government. So there's me again with my Aloha neck pillow and my colleagues behind me, and the individual there in black behind me was one of the Afghan women that were on our flight. Her children, you can't see them in the picture, but they're there. And so, one of the stories that I, wanted to mention earlier that I'll include now is so I worked quite thoroughly with the local staff at the embassy, the Afghan staff at the embassy. And one of the efforts that I had to work with them on was with the destruction and maintenance and destruction of armored vehicles. And one individual in particular, his name was Abdul Rahman. He was the guy I worked with hand in hand when it came to identifying armored vehicles that we were trying to destroy before we left. And the last day, it was Friday evening, and he was still working, and he was calling me. He called me up. He's like, Nico, I need your signature on these documents to account for the vehicles that we're trying to destroy. If I don't get these signatures, we're gonna get in big trouble or whatever. And I was like, brother, I said, we're leaving, right? Like, if you don't leave now, and take care of your family, you're going to be at a detriment. And nobody gives a crap about these papers. But I care about you, and I care about your well-being of your family, and that's what your priority needs to be right now. But he couldn't grasp, like he had done, I don't know how long he had been with the embassy, for years, right? But it's a microcosm story of the greater good that our local staff do for us in these embassies, because it literally, before me, was the embodiment of the dedication that they give to us and to the mission. Because at this time, he was more worried in our last hours about documenting the destruction of an armored vehicle than just walking away and taking care of his family. Yeah, so I don't know what happened to him. I lost track, but it's just one story that still resonates with me about the importance of why we go out of our way to take care of the local staff, these Afghans who have dedicated literally their entire lives to what we were doing in their country. And so the picture on the right is one of the hangars, one of the many hangars we were using. And what this, you can kind of see the little plastic chain thing there. I jumped on top of a box and just took a picture of the hangar to document the conditions that these folks were in. These folks actually had it better than most, because they actually had, you could see there the beds in there. And so what I would do was, I had my badge on, my embassy badge, my Kabul badge. I'd go up to the little fence line there, and people would just come to me and start asking me, like, hey, many of them had badges from the embassy. They were local staff that some of them even recognized, like, hey, I saw you in the lunch line a week ago or something, and do you remember me? I was like, oh, but I see your badge. Obviously, you were there. And they're just like, can you help me? Can you get my family and this, that, and the other? And at that point in time, you have to be honest with people. You can't BS them, because sometimes you just got to let them know that, look, this is not a good situation. We're doing the best that we can, but I know it's not good enough right now, but just know that people are working to make it better. But it's going to take a while. And some of them would just look at you with blank stares, like, what do you mean you can't help us anymore? Than, and that's the kind of stuff that me as I've been shot at, I've been rocketed, I've been in convoys that got attacked and blown up, but that no amount of training can prepare you for dealing with that personal, like, experience with thousands of children and women and elderly and colleagues, literally colleagues, Afghan colleagues that had to deal with these circumstances. So just again, more shots of the hangars. This was a different hangar, as I mentioned. You can see they don't even have the luxury of beds. It's just a concrete floor in a hangar. And don't let the AC lines fool you. Very, very hot in there. I was just overwhelmed with the number of people that were in there. So the picture on the left, where it was a group of our Afghan translators who I mentioned earlier, who voluntarily stayed behind to assist us in the processing of these thousands of Afghan folks that we were trying to get through the system. Obviously, if you don't recognize him, that's Secretary of State Blinken to the right, who I formerly worked for on his protection detail. He offered to meet with our Afghan translators and personally thank them for what they were doing and what they had done. Secretary of Defense Austin was there as well. He's not in the photo, but he was standing right next to Secretary Blinken. And so one story I'll give you, Halima, who's in the white shirt with the black necktie. She was at the gate, at the gate that was attacked in Kabul. She worked with the Marines that were killed. She helped them at the first line of intervention with Afghans that were trying to get into the airport. The Marines were there to pat people down, make sure they didn't have any weapons or whatever, and the translators were there to to give the translation of the instruction to the Afghans. And so that's how she come to know and work with those Marines at the gate. And when the explosion happened, the only thing that saved her was she was behind a concrete barrier, what we call T-wall, and she was spared. I have a picture of her with, shrapnel, basically just debris that had, littered her face. And so after that event, she got linked up with a colleague of mine who was escorting a 4-year-old girl who reminded me of my own daughter when I saw them arrive in Doha. And she was just a mess. She was a complete mess. She was bawling and crying. And I just couldn't help but go and approach them. And that's when I first met Halima. And I was just like, hey, what's wrong with the little girl? And what's going on? Like, what is there any way I can help? And they said, well, at that time, the story we had received was her mother had been killed in the explosion and she was an orphan, basically. But her father was in the US and they were escorting her to the US to meet with her father. And so Halima was going along because the little girl didn't speak English. And Halima was telling me, she's blaming Casey for taking her from her family in Kabul, and she just wants to go home. So that's why she's crying. I said, well, I have a little girl who looks a lot like her. I have an idea. And so we went to the Dairy Queen on the base, and I gave her some ice cream and French fries, and they said that was the first time she had smiled and laughed and carried on since they left Kabul. And she was keeping Halima and Casey up the whole time, crying. And now she was finally kind of a little bit at ease. And she started talking to me. She just was chatting. And my Dari had long since left me from the last time I was in Afghanistan. And I was like, all right, Halima, help me out here. And she just started laughing herself. She's like, she's told you that, okay, you can stay with me, but only until I get home, and then you have to leave. And so, long story short, she made it home. Asma was her name. She made it home to her family in the US. I have a picture of her there, and she's that happy. And that was one of the very few wins that we had, success stories that we had in that effort. And the picture on the right is just the last aircraft, literally the last aircraft that left Kabul with the ambassador, the rest of the remaining, the remainder of my team that was still at the airport, and also the last contingent of the military command that was in Kabul. They all left together on this aircraft and arrived in Doha, where we met them. And the ambassador landed, and we had this hoorah thing going on. And a few minutes later, after they all tested for COVID, my colleague Tony had to tell the ambassador that he tested positive for COVID and he would not be going anywhere. And he just kind of ducked his head and was like, of course I did. It was just adding to everything else that had gone wrong for him. But luckily, about, I think, 4 days later, we were able to get him on a medevac flight to the US. And he made it home. He's now retired, enjoying his hard-earned retirement with his wife in Milwaukee, I believe. So.
Well, thank you for these stories and for sharing the pictures with us and for sharing these really powerful stories. And of course, for your service there. So one last question for me, which is, as we talked over time, reinforcements came in from all over the world, from all the different agencies, and you kind of shifted, your role kind of shifted to standing up the Afghanistan Affairs Unit. You mentioned this briefly at the top. Tell us a little bit more about what this Afghanistan Affairs Unit is, and what did that look like? Like, what does it mean to stand up something like that?
Yeah, so, a couple of weeks after we were in Doha, everybody had been, the remainder of our embassy staff obviously had been removed from the country. the machine that was the processing of the refugees was starting to slowly come together. Order was, very, very slowly being brought in. It took about, I would say it was a good 6 weeks before I looked around and was like, okay, we're better.
Order seems like a relative term in these types of situations.
Yeah. So we were working day in and day night, hours on end. Everybody was. Nobody had any breaks. But anyway, so like I said, as the orders started to fall, we were getting more and more resources in the form of mostly people that we needed assistance with. Part of that was the initial team that came out to essentially stand up what is now called the Afghan Affairs Unit, which is Mission Kabul Forward in Doha. Diplomacy still had to go on. Ambassador Khalil Fazad, who was the primary interlocutor with the Taliban in Doha, went back to the US, ultimately retired officially, and then the Afghan Affairs Unit took over the responsibility of engaging with the Taliban and any other diplomatic efforts that were needed to be addressed for Afghanistan. So that's what the AAU was. Myself and Tony, who were the only two remaining RSOs, DS agents from Kabul, were asked to come and be the representative regional security officers, speaking for the AAU, and that's what we did. And I think the third week of September, Tony ended up having to depart. He was going on to his follow-on assignment in lovely Milan, where he's doing great things there, deservedly so. I remained and was literally the last embassy employee not to return to the US, and just served to the extent that I could as the RSO representative to the AAU. And so obviously the AAU was working hand in hand with Embassy Doha, who was maybe around 40 Americans, and we were quickly matching their numbers as the AAU grew and became its own monster, operating essentially out of the hotel. And but we started looking at things like, okay, well, this is going to become a permanent established team. We need residences, we need office space, we need all the manner of things that any other diplomatic mission would need, because Embassy Doha just isn't outfitted to resource our team. And so my responsibility was just to work hand in hand with Embassy Doha RSO Will Vaughn to try to represent equities of the AAU for regional security.
Okay. Thank you. That was it for questions from me. I know we have a few questions from our audience, and I realize we're a little bit short on time, but let me try to get through as many as I can. Bear with me while I pull them up right now. Okay, so the first question, you mentioned this already, but maybe just as a more general thing, can you talk about the role of the locally employed staff in the RSO shop during the evacuation?
So, the local staff far outnumber the American staff in the mission, in most missions, I should say. In Kabul was a little unique because of the sheer size of the mission, the number of security personnel we had to have. And so, but essentially the way it's structured is you typically will have an American lead, an American deputy over a certain section, right? So I gave the example of Abdul Rahman. He worked in the general service section that was managing our fleet, our armored vehicle fleet, as well as our unarmored vehicle fleet. And so that was his portfolio as a local staff. He managed the vehicles, and reported to the American staff on the status of those resources. And so every section, food service, fuel, security, housing, any, think any resource that you could think of that a facility would need has local staff there to do the lion's share of the day-to-day work. And the Americans, frankly, are just there to oversight, give direction, make sure it's in line with the overall diplomatic mission and in line with the chief of missions directives, right? So that's kind of how that works. And the reality is, from my perspective, and I tell my guys this, I said, it says U.S. Embassy on the placard in front of the wall facing, the street. But the reality is, it's your embassy. It's not my embassy. You were here before I came. You'll be here after I leave. My life will go on after I leave here. But if this mission ends, everything that you've spent your life dedicating, time and effort to evaporates, right? And that's exactly what happened with our staff in Afghanistan. People had been there for 20 plus years, 5, 10, 20, years. And that's, some of them, maybe that may have been their only job, their only profession, there every day, right? And in 4 days, it was gone. I can't relate to that.
Thank you. So from your experience, and again, I think you've sort of touched on this, but if you can tell us what you think, what made this evacuation uniquely challenging. Obviously, the speed with which it took is one of the key things, but are there any lessons that you think we as a government learned from that?
Well,
or you hope we learned?
So for me, I'll speak for me personally. I can't speak for the U.S. government writ large. The lesson that I took away was, my guys know my motto is, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And I feel comfortable in saying that we hope for the best, but maybe didn't prepare for the worst in some aspects. That's kind of how things went the way they did with the rapidly compressing timeline, primarily driven by, obviously, the rapid advance of the Taliban over the country, which, some folks, it's funny, right? Like, you've heard this saying, hindsight's 20/20, but there were a lot of people that were kind of speculating that the Taliban would do X, Y, and Z, but those were very, very quiet suggestions, right? But afterwards, once the Taliban raised the Taliban flag in Kabul and they're doing their thing, everybody's like, see, I told you so. And scores of people came out and said, we all, for me, on the security team, on the ground, getting the assessments from our leadership, it didn't happen that way. I'll just say that. So the lesson learned is, again, from my own preparedness, moving forward, the way I approach what I do here at Embassy Abuja, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's my lesson.
Thanks. Here's another question. Can you talk about the relationship between the Diplomatic Security Service and the U.S. Marines that are stationed at embassies?
Oh, wow. So, some of my colleagues are going to beat me up about this. I don't remember exactly what year that relationship was established, but in a nutshell, the Marines, we call them Marine Security Guards, MSGs, that program falls under the portfolio of the RSO office, Regional Security Office. They are essentially our face of security to the embassy personnel. The moment you walk into the embassy, they're there at what we call Post 1. They are there 24/7, operating the alarms, watching cameras, operating access in and out of the facilities, and in times of emergency, whatever emergency that may be, they can be reacted to provide security, but also they're trained in medical response. They're trained in working with host nation security elements to respond to security threats and things of that nature. So they're our first line of defense as a regional security office to the embassy mission. But they are restricted. They're not at that moment or that time that they're assigned to the State Department. They're no longer Department of Defense. They're still Marines. They still wear their uniform, but they can't be employed in an active, offensive role. They can't go outside of the embassy and, conduct missions or anything like that. They're strictly as a defensive element for the Marine or for the embassy compound and for the community.
Thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions. I realize we're 1 minute to go, but this one is, take this as in whichever direction you want to, but what do you feel propelled you to where you are today, academically, personally, otherwise?
I'm an overachiever, in my opinion. I think the common denominator that I had with my classmates when I first came into diplomatic security, there were 48 of us. Most of us had some international experience in some way, shape, or form, either as a student, for personal travel, professional. Like in my case, I was active duty military, and then reservist as well. So I brought that to bear. A lot of us had prior military and/or prior law enforcement experience, but not everyone. Some came from private sector. We had some that were straight up they were students and maybe had an internship with. I think we had a couple of interns at I forget I'm drawing a blank, but they had internships with international law enforcement organizations, and so yeah. It's a myriad of folks, but I would say overwhelmingly the common denominator was we all had some level of international experience, either personally or professionally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the last question is, you mentioned you had military experience before that. I think you said you were 11 years in the Navy, active duty. How is working in DSS different or similar to your military experiences?
Yeah, a lot of similarities culturally within diplomatic security mainly. But for us, what I found now being overseas, when I was still in the US doing diplomatic security stuff, I was around primarily just other agents, right? So culturally, that's a very similar place to be, obviously. But as I went overseas, transitioned overseas, it was less, by far less agents, but more, traditional diplomats, right? And so what I was impressed upon first, and what sticks with me till today, is you're a diplomat first, and you're a diplomatic security service agent second, which is one of the things that differentiates us from other federal law enforcement. An FBI agent is an FBI agent, a DEA agent is a drug enforcement agent, you know what I mean? A U.S. Marshal is a U.S. Marshal, right? So for us, I'm a diplomat first, and then a special agent second. When I go out and meet with our international counterparts or host nation, they don't necessarily look at me as Agent Figueroa. They just see me as a representative of the U.S. government, as an American who's there doing diplomatic activity. So that's what we have to keep in perspective. And that's the differentiation from being in the military. In the military, you go overseas, you're still in the military, right? Like you're a military service member, and that's how they look at you. But I don't wear a uniform. I love my Aloha shirts and my African print and stuff. But I don't wear my rank on my sleeve. And I'm just Nico, American, diplomat Nico, not Officer Figueroa. So that's really the biggest difference, I think.
Well, thank you. And thank you for coming to talk to us today and for giving us your time and your wonderful stories. Really appreciate it. As I said, we will have the recording of this uploaded to our YouTube channel soon. So please, if you've liked it, share it with other folks as well. I think these are stories that need to be heard. And for other things, we do have a compilation actually of stories by other diplomats who participated in Operation Allies Refuge. And we'll drop the link. It's in our Foreign Service Journal, March edition. We'll drop the link. Take a look at those. There are some other really fascinating stories from both, those who participated like Nico in Doha, but also those who were in Afghanistan helping to get folks out. And finally, if you like these programs, let us know. Take the survey. It takes 2 minutes to answer the survey. And then if you or others are interested in being parts of our events list, distribution list, you can email us at events@afsa.org. So thanks, Nico. Again, thanks everyone for coming today, and have a great day. See you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye.